This is the Human Action Podcast with your hosts, Jeff Deist and Dr. Bob Murphy.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again. This is the Human Action Podcast. It's the last show of 2022. We hope all of you enjoyed the show this year. We hope you stayed with us. We hope that all of you have a very, very happy weekend and a very happy new year coming. And that's our subject today. I'm joined, as always, by soon-to-be Florida man, Dr. Bob Murphy. And our show today is basically 2023 predictions in terms of economics, politics, related subjects. So first of all, Bob, how you doing? And congratulations on your new house.
Well, thanks a lot. I appreciate that. And yeah, hopefully I won't be reported in the news as one of those Florida men, but we'll see what happens.
Yes. So I want to start, we have 5 categories: the economy, the Fed, politics, global events, and cultural events. So I'll start with the economy, my own prediction. I don't know what's going to happen with inflation numbers. I'm not sure what's going to happen with unemployment numbers, for example. But I will predict this. I think that this much vaunted de-dollarization, people like Peter Schiff talk about that a lot. I think that the opposite will happen. I think that the dollar will continue to strengthen against global currencies. If you look at the dollar index, obviously that's the dollar versus the euro, the Japanese yen, some other major currencies. There's nothing happening in those countries politically. There's nothing happening in terms of the central bank policies of those countries that give me any confidence that they will be a less dirty shirt than the US dollar. So I think even though there will be greater economic uncertainty in 2023, I'm not sure gold will spike. I think it'll stay steady or rise. It stayed steady at about 1,800 at the beginning and end of 22. So I think a lot of people will be purchasing gold without necessarily the spot price of gold going up. In other words, gold velocity, if we have to use that term, will increase because we saw this from the crash of 07, 08, well into about 2012. You saw a lot more people hedging, I suppose, by buying gold. So I think more people will buy gold regardless of whether the price of gold's going up or down. I suspect it'll rise slightly throughout the year, but none of this will affect the dollar's relative strength against other currencies. When things are weird in this world, people tend to want US dollars. People tend to want dollar-denominated debt because at least treasuries are paying, 3%, 4%, whatever they're paying relative to other sovereign debt. And so I think all of this actually bodes well in the short term for King Dollar, as Larry Kudlow says. And I don't think that there's going to be any kind of dollar crisis, but I don't have any particular thoughts on inflation, unemployment, GDP, because those are such huge macro elements that they're out of my league.
Okay, yeah, my views largely coincided with yours on this stuff, Jeff. So I do think that there'll probably be an official recession, by which I mean later down the road when the NBER says, when did the next recession begin? I think they will probably clock it by December of this year. And that's just looking at things like the inverted yield curve. Like you look at the 10-year minus the 3-month, which is one that's been very robust going back to World War II. That thing's been inverted for a while now. And, just eyeballing it and looking at, from when, it bottomed out and then started rising in terms of the spread, being negative, it's conceivable it could spill over into 2024 early, but it probably would the official recession would kick in by this upcoming calendar year by the end of it. And also with inflation, I know, and I'm guilty of this too, sort of joking about, Powell, the money printer and whatnot, but like the inflation, and I know we'll talk more about the Fed specifically in a minute here, but just in terms of the consumer price inflation metrics, that actually, there was a big monthly number back in July of 2022, but then since then, the monthly figures have actually been fairly modest, like within what they've been in the previous 10 years, let's say. And so, the year over year or the 12-month change has still been high, but that's just because there was so much built in up to that point. So the last 5 months or so, it actually hasn't been that big a deal. So it wouldn't surprise me if the overall, going from December, 2023 to this, December 2022, it wouldn't surprise me if, again, the government's numbers are fudged and whatnot, but by that official metric, if it's 5% or less that wouldn't surprise me. And partly for the reason you're saying, Jeff, that as this recession, as the economy slows down, people get scared, they don't spend as much. And just talking about Peter Schiff, so he was right. All those clips, like the housing bubble years when people were laughing in his face and he was so prescient, he got the dollar call wrong on that too, and for the similar reason. So everything, his diagnosis of what was wrong with the U.S. economy was correct, but the crisis was so bad, people panicked and flooded, rushed to treasuries. And so even though he was telling his clients the dollar's in trouble and his fundamental analysis was right, actually the dollar strengthened in the period where, if you had just gone off it, everything he said about housing was correct. So I think it's a similar situation here. His critique of U.S. policy is totally right in the fundamentals, but again, when people panic right now, they're still going to go to the U.S. dollar and treasury. So at least in the short run, that might actually strengthen it, paradoxically. But yeah, in the long run, I don't think the U.S. dollar is going to be the world's reserve currency. I mean, it's slipping as we speak, but yeah, I think that's just going to continue in the long run.
Well, I should mention, I love Peter Schiff. I follow him. I think he's a heroic guy. And certainly his father was a real hero who paid a serious price for free speech by going to federal prison. But, I mean, we're allowed to disagree with Peter Schiff. Maybe the biggest macro story happening right now, very quietly, not much remarked upon, of course, is that for the first time in decades, M2 is dropping.
Right.
M2 has dropped slightly in 2022. So that's new. And the other untold story is that really just since COVID in 2020, for the first time since the 90s, the M2 velocity index is going up. So, it's hard to understand, there's so many multi-factors to all this, but it's true. Generally speaking, in tough times, people hunker down. And so no matter how much money a central bank creates, if people aren't doing anything with it, including banks lending it, then M2 velocity tends to fall. But it's going up since COVID. So, all that stimulus at some point on the fiscal side, as opposed to the monetary policy side, yeah, that does have an effect. So let's move on to the Fed, obviously hugely interrelated to the topic, the broader topic of the economy. But in terms of what our Fed will actually do, I'm going to say that they will pivot on this interest rate thing. Now, that's not a bold prediction, of course, but Daniel Lacaille, a great economist, great friend of ours, he says, well, the biggest central bank worry is stagflation. So they have to kill inflation at all costs. So they will continue to reduce M2 and raise rates as necessary to do that. I'm not sure about that because I view the Fed ultimately as a political organization at the end of the day. And I view the dollar ultimately and interest rates as political tools that these clowns use to try to control us. And so my feeling is at the end of the day, if it comes to fighting inflation and helping the little guy, or if it comes to serving equity and bond markets, including sovereign debt, which of course Uncle Sam has to pay interest on every year, I think if that's the choice, that Powell and our central bankers choose the equity and bond markets and pull back on these interest rate hikes, and they'll never let us get anywhere close to, let's say, the Volcker years. And let's not forget, there are huge political lobbies, the housing industry folks, the auto industry folks. If automobile loans are at 10%, even for people with good credit, that may be politically unfeasible. And these guys are politicians.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I think what we're going to actually see is they may hike one or two more times, but at some point, I think, as the economy continues to weaken, if I'm right, that the CPI measures continue to either tread water or come, because again, to be clear, they just need to stay where they've been the last 5 months, and ultimately the year over year is going to come right back down to the typical range of recent vintage. It's not that they even need to bring inflation down anymore. They just need to keep doing what they've been doing, and then the year over year comes back down. So I think if that happens, then yeah, they're eventually going to cut again, and that's consistent with, again, the yield curve pattern to show, like, why is it that the 10-year 3-month inverts It's because the Fed tightens and the Fed has more control over short rates. And so that's why the 3 months shoots above the long run 10-year and so forth. And then when they relent, it goes back to a, quote, normal upward sloping yield curve. So I think you're going to see that play out this upcoming calendar year. And just in terms of, we have a great example to show what the Fed's doing. So they switched in 2021 to average inflation targeting. Mm-hmm. And critics at the time, including me, I should go look and see like how accurate was I. This is what I was thinking. I don't know if I typed it up, but I think I did, to say this isn't like some bold move in the terms of academic discovery and, oh wow, they've seen the light and they've read Scott Sumner's blog post, that this is just their excuse to be able to get away with price inflation at the time running well above what their target was, to say, oh, it's not that, any given 6-month period, we got to hit the target. It's just over time on average. And so what that meant was cut us some slack. We're going to have actual price inflation be above our stated target, but don't worry, down the road, we're going to have actual inflation be below the target so that the long run average comes out to be. And then as of March 2022, Scott Sumner, if people don't know that name, he's the leader of the so-called market monetarists. And he was angry at the Fed at that point, saying, because as of March of 2022, the Fed's from their memos and whatnot, their long-run inflation forecast, by which I mean consumer price inflation, was just around 2%. And he was upset because he was saying, well, they just threw out the average inflation targeting out the window because they need to let it run below, the target in order so that on average it balances out. And it was showing, no, they let it run hot for a while. And now at best they're saying in the long run, we will finally bring it down so that the new numbers are what our target is, meaning on average, we're running way hot. And that's what the critics were saying, that this isn't, some 5D chess. Wow, they really, are studying the MIT people. Well, I guess it wouldn't be MIT, different schools, Chicago school, and getting it. It's that this is just a way to buy them some time so people get off their back. And that's what it looks like they did. And if they were doing that when unemployment wasn't even high by historical standards back then, and yet they were letting price inflation run way above their own stated target for a long time. So it has, they have been tightening since last April, right? The Fed's balance sheet was gently going up still through late April, but it actually has been trending down, and that coincides, like you're saying, Jeff, with the fact that M2 has actually been shrinking, which is very unusual. So the Fed actually has been tightening for the last 5-6 months by any measure, not just raising rates, but also, reducing what they hold in their portfolio. But I don't think that if things start to get painful, I think they're going to back off real fast. And one measure is the last thing I'll mention, the S&P 500. Right now, that's roughly where it was about 20 months ago. And so I think if that continues to just tread water or go down, eventually, the Fed's going to say, we've been too tight, we got to loosen up.
Right. And unless you're a baby boomer, you've basically never lived your adult life in a period, a baby boomer or older. You've basically never lived your adult life in a period where M2 was shrinking. Yeah. So that really is different. But it's a neat rhetorical trick, because if you view 2%, the targeted inflation rate, as a line, and then you sort of view a sine wave going above and below it, now they can rhetorically backtrack and say, hey, look, CPI was 0 or even negative for all those years up till now. So it's okay if it goes to 8 or 9% for a while, because over time it's going to average out. Well, nobody was saying that 5 years ago. This is new. Right. So this strikes me as a gigantic cope from these guys. So let's move on then to politics, our third subject. So here's my sort of big political predictions for 2023, which is that Biden, who is clearly mentally and physically infirm, nonetheless continues in his own bizarre way to maintain, and just maintaining is almost growing in terms of his putrid stature, and that Donald Trump shrinks quite a bit. I mean, I think there's a lot of Trump fatigue. I think his decision not to come back to Twitter, he'll have to reverse that at some point, because he'll see these goofy announcements on Truth Social or whatever aren't working. I think he's got to bear a lot of the blame for his COVID overreaction, the vaccines, all that stuff is tied up with Trump. So the Democrats look at the midterms And all of a sudden, Joe Biden doesn't look so bad anymore. If he had suffered a catastrophic loss in those midterms or red wave, yes, they would be knifing him in the back and they'd be figuring out who was going to run next time. But since he didn't have a catastrophic result, I think they're looking around. Kamala Harris is, a mental invalid. The senators they have are just awful. The governors they have, the guy in New York had to step down. Cuomo, Gavin Newsom out in California, he'd certainly like to run, but I think for the majority of the country, his COVID performance and his economic performance and everybody pooping on the street and dropping syringes in San Francisco. I mean, whether those are actually real or that's just a tiny part of San Francisco, I think symbolically Gavin Newsom was going to have a real hard time running nationwide. So I think Biden's the best they've got. I think Biden would beat Trump by a bigger margin if that was in fact the rematch. I don't think it'll be Trump. I think Ron DeSantis actually has a lot of problems outside of Florida. I don't think he plays nearly as well outside of the state of Florida as a lot of Republicans think he does. He's basically neocon on foreign policy, so I don't love that. And I think that the Republican establishment, the Bill Kristols, the Kevin McCarthys, the Mitch McConnells are going to come up with some kind of dark horse candidate that's going to surprise everybody, and that their stature will emerge or begin to emerge in 2023, even though it's not an election year, that this person, whether they be, a governor, a senator, I don't think they'll go with Mitt Romney again, but whoever it is, someone more palatable to the dreadful entity known as Conservatism, Inc., the National Review types will arise. So we're thinking Trump or DeSantis. I think there's a third candidate out there, a dark horse, and they're going to have to begin to become known in 2023 if they intend to actually run and compete in the 24 election. So that's my political prediction, along with the fact that the Biden administration will be unable to resurrect COVID as an animating feature of American life. They want to. They want masks back on airplanes. They want to get back to hectoring people about vaccines and masks. But that's just too much. The public is just shrugging too forcefully. I spent a day in the Phoenix and Atlanta airports just 2 days ago. And, there's some masks, but you're not going to get that broad mass of people to ever go back, in my view, because look, you got these crowded planes, everybody's sniffling and coughing, and people just realize, I think now, that the current variant is kind of the flu. A lot of people are sick, but that you're never going to be able to sell it again as the pandemic, despite how much some of these monsters would love to sell it as such.
Yeah, my views, I think, are almost like the mirror image in terms of the political parties. Not that I'm disagreeing with what you're saying about the Republicans, but I was getting ready to say, if I'm the Democrats, I think I want to just have something in place and start like getting feelers out and just lay the groundwork in case Biden is just so bad mentally that it just won't even work. Now, I know people can say, well, look at what happened with Fetterman and stuff. So clearly all people care about is what the policies are. And if you say, yeah, but that person's just a puppet and it's the machine that's behind them. And they say, yeah, exactly. So we like this, the Democrat machine more than we like the Republican machine. So that's why we're voting for him. What's your point? So, I get that. But I think they do want to at least keep their options open. So they're going to try to get some. And yeah, I haven't heard a word about Kamala Harris in 6 months. It's like she's nothing. And so that clearly, and I think she's just so unlikable, and so I don't think it could possibly be her. So yeah, I agree with you. All the other possible contenders, they have huge liabilities. So I think, just like you're saying, that the Republicans are maybe going to look around and see, is there somebody we can like test the waters with and do A/B tests on or something just to see, will this play? I think the Democrats need to do that, and we'll start seeing those auditions, if you will, in 2023. Just to see, we got to make sure in case Biden just is absolutely, unusable for us, that, we have a fallback position.
Yeah, and there are certainly still people on the Democratic side who would like to supplant Joe Biden. There's ego. This isn't all, carefully calculating what's best for the party. I mean, we can talk about tribal voting, and that's why Fetterman won. But nonetheless, there are millions and millions of people in the state of Pennsylvania who didn't just have a stroke and don't walk around looking like Lurch, that they could have, nominated. So it's very strange. I think in the progressive mindset, there's almost a desire to punish and impose. Right? Let's just get these really average people. Average people shouldn't be U.S. senators. I mean, come on. There's 100 U.S. senators on Earth. You should be an exceedingly impressive person. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when senators were like smart and mean. Now they're just mean. Mm-hmm. And that's a change. I mean, they used to generally come from wealthier families. They had more Ivy League pedigrees. They generally were of a different cut and class than the House. The House was designed to be more sort of the people's house, and the rabble are represented over there, and it's not a deliberative body. They have to these elections every 2 years, and there's a cacophony, but then the Senate is the moderating influence. And I think social media and 24-hour cable news has just ruined the Senate. It's prevented it from being the kind of body it should be. So it's just a glorified House at this point. So, that you're going to continue to get candidates from clown world directly into the U.S. Senate, and who was the other guy? A Turk. Yeah, let's have, I mean, I love Turkey. Are we supposed to have Turkish dual citizens in the U.S. Senate? That's the choice in the state of Pennsylvania. I don't know what to say to that.
Let me also mention it while we're talking politics. I do think in 2023 things are going to get continue to be polarized, more open violence in the streets and so forth. And maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that in a separate category. But I think secession or de facto decentralization is going to be more openly discussed. That people are going to realize trying to work through Washington D.C. is just this is not working. We got to do something different. So I think that the interest in that sort of strategy, I think you'll see a big boost of that in 2023 as things just really, the economy enters recession. As bad as stuff is now, imagine if unemployment is 5 points higher, that sort of thing.
But I think that progressives would have been more amenable to that if they had, in fact, suffered a red wave in the fall. But when they don't, I think that gets them back into their mindset of inevitability. Conservatives, Republicans are dinosaurs. They're, younger people are in far more progressive, far more identifying as LGBT, whatever it might be. And so we're going to rout these guys. Why should we give up a single square centimeter of turf? When in fact, they could have a lot more of what they want right here, right now, if they were willing to go along with a more federalist system. But you see clearly that they aren't. I mean, look at the freakout over Roe v. Wade.
Right.
I mean, literally every state in the country now could, under the new rubric of that decision, have far more permissive abortion laws than the trimester system set up in Roe v. Wade, right? So if anything, in a sense, progressives should be celebrating because now they can have exactly what they want in California and Massachusetts and whatever. But that's not the way it works. It's a winner-take-all, federal, nationalized, centralized mindset. And honestly, libertarians fall prey to this too with, I think, the universalist mindset. There are surely universal human truths and universal applications of the idea of violence and nonviolence, property. But beyond that, the political manifestation of that, I argue that universalism is just a terrible idea, and that most of the people pushing it, Western globalists, are bad people with bad intentions, and that we ought to be pushing hard to make the 21st century the opposite of the 20th, which was characterized by the centralization of political power, either the national level or in many cases even the international level. So I'm just not sure that progressives are ever going to go along with this, because apart from the fact that they think they're inevitable and that they're winning, is they have this white savior complex, right? Like, well, we can't let those rednecks down in Alabama and Florida have, force these abortion restrictions on women. So we can't have every state deciding separately, and I don't know how you overcome that.
Oh, actually, it's not that. I totally agree with what you're saying. So when I say you're going to see interest in this grow, I meant from the people on the right, and they're going to realize we on paper they should have done very well in the last election, and they didn't. And I also agree with you that Trump, the fact that his handpicked candidates didn't win, I think I was listening to an episode of Dave Smith and his sidekick Robbie the Fire there, and they made a good point to say in 2016 when Trump was first running, he was going to say I'm going to be a winner, and it was plausible, because he was successful in these other arenas. But at this point, to just say, well, the election was stolen from me, and the reason we lost this last time was because of blah blah blah, and it's say what you will, but he didn't win. And so that was his trump card, no pun intended. And so, that does take kind of the wind out of his sails to explain why it was stolen from me. Well, if he's such a winner, he shouldn't have let that happen. Right. So I agree with that. And so, yes, I think you're right, Jeff, that I'm saying people on the right are going to turn more to secession and people on the left are going to say, no, we absolutely can't let them go that route because we know we've got, the voting system and the, universalist system all wrapped up. There was a little hiccup there for the Trump years, but, we dealt with that and we're okay now. And, we get to rule the world.
Bob, are you getting your politics from comedians on Twitter?
I think that's the safest route.
Well, all right. Well, let's move to our next category, global events. And so let's talk about a comedian who addressed the U.S. Congress.
Okay.
And was feted by said Congress. This is a family show. He was almost fellated by that Congress. Let me just leave it at that. So my prediction for 2023 global events is that across the West, but particularly in the United States, our enthusiasm for the Ukraine conflict will wane. In other words, Americans have a very short attention span. They love to change their little social media avatar to the Ukraine flag. They love to look at TikTok nurses and call them heroes and that kind of thing. But Americans tend to move on to the next big thing. That's a very uniquely American impulse. We don't know a lot about history. We tend to know less about geography and the politics of the rest of the world than other countries do because we're so dominant culturally, economically, politically. So I think that the Ukraine war will grind on, but in some pretty unpleasant ways. I mean, ultimately the fact of Russian military superiority will either force the West to put more than just weapons into Ukraine, but boots on the ground, which is a tough decision. And winter is coming. If you follow Vitaly Klitschko, one of the great boxing brothers, who is mayor of Kiev, he's come out and basically said this could be an apocalyptic situation in the cold Ukrainian winter for the city because we may well have power outages. And so it's going to be hard for people to eat and keep warm, and they may have to flee the city. People forget he has made his peace with Zelensky, but prior to the Russian invasion, he was very much a political opponent. And of course, he's a very famous boxer, very, very wealthy guy. So he was certainly a potential candidate to be president of Ukraine or to be a major political force there. And he has put that aside for the war. But, as the war grinds on, Zelensky may well lose some of his popularity. He may lose some popular support from Western governments, especially, even normie Americans are looking around at the economy and inflation and starting to question this next round of $100 billion that Congress promised during Zelensky's recent speech. So what's happening in Ukraine is a ground war with all of its casualties and sort of the reality of who's winning on the ground. But for the purposes of Americans, it's a war of perception. It's a media war. How is it going? And if it appears to be going badly and the plucky Ukrainians are not so much prevailing against the aggressive Russian bear, I think our politicians in a murky economy at best here at home are going to have a hard time selling this on an ongoing basis, like this should be what we're all focused on. Americans will focus on that for a while, but I think 2023 is the year that they, I don't want to say abandon the Ukrainian cause, because I think most Americans from polling will still support it and want them to win and kick the Russians out. But in terms of caring about it and thinking about it on a day-to-day level and virtue signaling about it, I think that's coming to an end.
Yeah, I think it's probably analogous to COVID. You just get fatigued. So it's not that a lot of people said, "Oh yeah, we were just totally wrong about." Most people don't ever say that about anything. But just like you say, the people who used to religiously, in our household, we were very serious up front. My wife had a lung condition, but even, as the variants changed and we were doing research and we relaxed just because you can't keep doing that forever. You got to, go back to normal. And so I think, like you say, same thing here, that eventually it can't be that 5 years from now, Americans are still going to be sending that much and that we're going to be daily checking to see, how are the Ukrainians doing in their valiant struggle? People are going to stop. They're going to get fatigued. And I think an element of it too, not that I'm any sort of geopolitical mastermind, but I think partly what was going on is that, Putin, if he wants to, he couldn't have been too brutal up till now. You know what I mean? He wanted to take that territory without causing too many civilian casualties, because that's sort of, you know what I mean? Like, that's just not good for what he's trying to do. And so there was a bit of that involved. But yes, if it comes down to his own survival politically versus causing more casualties, I think it's obvious which way he's going to choose. And so that, at some point, I think more people in Ukraine are going to realize that this is not worth it. We could have a negotiated peace right now, make some concessions, give Putin face-saving measures, and at least people stop freezing to death. And I think that's the moral outcome as well.
Well, maybe 30 years ago, before social media, he would have been far more brutal, because we would have been depending on the New York Times or CNN or whomever to bring us the news about this. And America's lost something there. You talk to older folks about the Vietnam War, and of course, your neighborhood, your street, your town tended to have a bunch of young boys over there. And they really reported the casualties and stuff every night. Walter Cronkite would come on and talk to the American people about this or that battle was waging. And so people stuck with that in Vietnam engagement for several years. I mean, their attention stayed with that. That was more real, more concrete. And American boys were coming home in body bags. That faded quite a bit during our Afghan and Iraq conflicts, because those just went on so long. And, we didn't have a draft any longer, and there was this sort of professional fighting force off to the side that does all that stuff, and these long deployments, and these poor reserve, National Guard and reserve guys going over there for years, and they didn't sign up for that. But nonetheless, the public's attention waned, and now you have a war where we're invested in it. From a foreign policy perspective, from a military aid perspective, from a financial aid perspective, but we probably do have some boots on the ground. But ostensibly, we don't have any boots on the ground. I'm not convinced that we don't have our people, maybe not DOD, military, active duty, but at least CIA or whatever, training on weapons and such. But they lie about that stuff constantly, so who knows? But nonetheless, this one is going to start to feel far away, and it
would be silly to give them all those weapons without customer support.
Yes, yes. It's like you call the call center in Bangalore. This RPG fired the wrong way into my house. But here's the thing: is that it's a little much. I know hypocrisy is part of politics. It's a tactic, not a vice. But to hear all these Western types talking about the nationalism of Ukraine's a nation. Well, I happen to agree. The Ukrainian people have a separate language. They have a separate culture. They have a separate people before the Russians, the Soviets, in a very perverse, way, tried to ethnically sort of insert a bunch of cultural and ethnic Russians into that, what we now call Ukraine. And, that's pretty unholy. So, I'm all for the sovereignty and national interests of the Ukrainians. But for Western globalists to suddenly care about this, it is just absolutely laughable. That's not what they care about. They don't care about Ukrainian sovereignty. They care about having a nice, happy satellite puppet right on Putin's doorstep that's basically NATO, if not literally NATO. And it goes along with all the social and cultural stuff that the West wants, LGBT and feminism and that sort of stuff. That's really what's animating, these Evan McMullins and David Frenches of the world. I can't stand these hypocrites. They don't care about the national interests of the Ukrainian people. If they did, we'd all be sending Snuggies to Kiev instead of sending them missiles.
Yeah, I think you're right in a lot of this too. Again, I can't speak so much to the neoconservatives. I mean, I think your analysis of where they're coming from, but
I can speak to the neoconservatives any day, all day.
Good. Yes, I think you understand them better than I do. But as far as like the left in general, it's hilarious to me, just the inversion of, because Donald Trump was nice to Putin, therefore all of a sudden the left despises Russia, everything Russian. They're trying to take over the world, and I mean, it's the flip flop when you watch old scenes from Dr. Strangelove. It's amazing how much today's left is like what the right was being caricatured as back in that movie, and it's just the flip flop. Anything Donald Trump is for, we must be against reflexively.
Yeah. Well, our final category for 2023 predictions is cultural events. Bob, there's so much going on. Why don't you kick us off here? What do you think is going to happen in America 2023?
So I think you're going to see, again, this continued spread of, call it lawlessness, like just open in broad daylight.
Okay.
We've seen already these videos of people just looting stores. I think that's going to continue to spread. The homicide rates, so there was a big jump in 2020. It was funny, people say, well, overall crime isn't so much, but, except for murders, had a huge jump in 2020. Then the FBI changed the way they collect the statistics, so it was a little bit unclear, what the numbers were from, going from 2020 to 21 and into this one. But, I think in terms of, in reality, objective reality, that, murder rates, especially in major cities, you're going to continue to see that, especially as the economy worsens, and people are going to look around and think, well, why are we being suckers? These major corporations are ripping us off. And they're not even necessarily wrong in thinking that. Like, the socialist critique is going to be wrong in terms of its overall diagnosis, but in terms of in the real world right now, are rich people ripping off poor people in the United States? I would say yes, through political means. And so you can understand, the anger, but they're going to turn to antisocial means of, expressing that anger. And then, more in terms of the ideology and whatnot, just as things that happened in 2022 that would have been inconceivable 10 years earlier, the stuff we're arguing about in terms of, what's a woman, if a boy just says, hey, I'm a girl, can I go into the girls' locker room in high school? And well, yes, of course. I think you're going to see more of that, but not just merely transgender stuff that we've already seen the seeds of it, but I think it's going to intensify the MAPS, so-called minor attracted persons, that there's going to be this big distinction between the overt behavior versus what your just proclivities are. And hey, if you're born that way, why can't you go teach in the public schools or something? That's a protected thing. So I think you're going to see a lot more of that, and just, using analogies with, this people used to be afraid of gay people, and, we all see what troglodytes they were. You don't want to be on the wrong side of history. So I think you're going to see more of that. The stuff with euthanasia, there's a big deal how Canada's pushing that. And unfortunately, I think some libertarian conservative types in the United States were just blaming that on socialized medicine. And that's coming here too. We already have seen some inklings of that. Among other things, that's the way they can deal with, the entitlement problem. I think you're going to see more emphasis on, if you're 85 years old and you're going to burn up, all your family's inheritance by just lasting another 3 months in, hospice or something, why don't you do the responsible thing for your family and just end it early and save that money for your children and grandchildren? I think you're going to see a pivot towards that. And lastly, just to throw out something provocative, again, just, crazy stuff that would have been inconceivable is what we saw in 2022. I think you'll see that. There's people talking about voluntary cannibalism. I'll throw that out there, Jeff. I don't know that it's going to be emphasized in 2020, but at some point we're going to be arguing, and you're going to see, Matt Walsh types and stuff saying, no, eating other people is wrong. I don't care if you get consent. And that's where we're going to be.
Cannibalism. Okay. Well, that's one way to wrap up the year thinking about cannibalism.
I wanted people to, in case I was losing people, I wanted to wake them up.
Yeah. I mean, that's interesting. Well, if you're worried about cannibalism, try to be a tough, stringy person that no one would want to eat, right? Don't be like a nice, sleek duck. But, going back to this crime thing, that's interesting. If violent crime, gun crime, murder, robbery continues to increase at the rate it has really since COVID, I mean, what does that mean, though? That strikes me as so much of what we think of as our capitalist day-to-day economy is premised on trust. Mm-hmm. The store has what it has, and if there's a fire, they have insurance, and you go there and you can purchase things. And if you travel in the third world much, if you go to Mexico City, if you go to Brazil, for example, in the cities, you will see armed guards employed by stores, and not just fancy jewelry stores like Tiffany's or something, but, pretty average retail stores. We've seen some of this crime at drugstores, for example, in in California and Washington states where the state legislature has decreed below a certain amount, let's say $1,000 of theft is not a felony. It's a police report, not necessarily an arrest. It's not even an arrest and release situation. It's oftentimes literally just a citation or a police report if the perpetrator is actually caught, which is not always the case. I mean, this is going to ripple through the entire economy. We're all going to pay more for stuff if security and loss, impose new costs on providers of stuff.
Yeah, and just going along with it too, it's already happened. I think in Philadelphia, where the certain gas station owner hired private security people like Kevlar vests and semi-automatic rifles just because carjackings were just happening all the time with his customers, and my customers don't want to have a gun put in their face. So what do we? Police aren't doing anything. What do we got to do? So yeah, I think you're just going to see more of that, and yeah, of course the costs go up, and it's going to be more of a bifurcation that the people that live in the wealthier neighborhoods are going to be more safe because they can afford to have the private security, and it's just there's going to be this more idea of two Americas is going to be intensified. So and again, if you're the people living in the poorer regions, you're going to think this is unfair. I didn't choose this system, and it's just going to further erode people's trust in the public institutions.
Well, see, that bothers me as an American. To see the homeless encampments in big cities, especially Skid Row in LA, the Tenderloin in San Francisco. I mean, that bothers me. That makes me ashamed. I do think we should care about that and try to do something about that. The crime stats are interesting, and our European friends love to beat us up on our gun crime rates. And it's true, we do have a lot more gun crime. But here's the thing. Here's why it doesn't have more political traction, I think, is because despite our European detractors, if you look at murder and violent crime in America, it is exceedingly isolated by zip code. So basically, if you take out certain zip codes, so sometimes crime stats are very misleading. You say, well, here's the homicide rate in Baltimore, or here's the homicide rate in Philadelphia or Chicago, or whatever it is. Well, it really depends. What's Philadelphia? What's Chicago? Does that include the suburbs, or are we talking about just the municipal city limits? I mean, it really depends, because violent crime, gun crime, is again exceedingly isolated, basically to the hood. So if you don't live in the hood and don't go to the hood, America is a very, very safe place statistically. And so I think a lot of people enjoy the luxury of living in a particular suburb. And so we read about all of this gun crime, but it doesn't really affect us or anybody we know. So that strikes me as, if that begins to spill over into more mainstream zip codes. And we've seen this, for example, we've seen this in San Francisco, where there are some very nice neighborhoods like Nob Hill, where, in $10 million houses, investment bankers and Silicon Valley big shots live there. And someone will pull up and carjack them there, or, put a gun against them and rob them of their wallet and their watch as they're coming out to check their mail. That happened to a certain hedge fund manager. That's the kind of thing where, these rich people, they can go get private security. Fine, they'll have a car driving around with an armed guard. But again, that starts to look and feel like the third world. Go to Mexico City. There are fantastically wealthy neighborhoods there. They have gates. They have concertina wire. Everybody has some kind of German Shepherd or whatever patrolling the perimeter. They have alarms. That's not the America I want to live in. I want to have sort of middle class decency here. And, that crime thing, could that become the big cultural issue of 2023? And that would very much spill over into especially state and local politics.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I know, again, the anecdotes, of course, but like in Nashville, and it's Green Hills is the neighborhood, very wealthy neighborhood, near the big malls and stuff. And, one of my friends there, his wife all of a sudden wanted to get a gun because some lady that was in her 70s down the street, broad daylight, was out gardening, and some guy came in and took her to her house and raped her. Just like, it was shocking kind of thing. And not that if it happened in a poorer neighborhood, it would be fine. I hope people get what I'm saying, but it was just things that you wouldn't have expected that 10 years ago. That would have been inconceivable, and yet that stuff is spilling over. And so, yes, it's when this stuff, like the fights people are getting into on social media where they openly call for each other's death, and it's just on social media. Why don't you just go out and get some sunlight and take a walk around the block and see your neighbor? People have been saying that for a while, that just turn off your social media, everything's fine. And no, it's not fine. And the two are becoming linked. And I think you're right, Jeff, that it's people who have been taught that certain groups are the enemy and have oppressed them and whatnot, and they don't deserve to live or something. I mean, these ideas have consequences. Like the left fully gets it, looking at Nazi Germany or something to understand. Look at the indoctrination and then look at what that spilled over into. Well, when you reverse it, that's going to happen too.
Well, so it sounds like your prediction is that America gets a little more kinetic in 2023.
That's one way of putting it.
I want America to get a little more bucolic in 23. I thought about this. I guess my mild prediction for 23 will be that we have reached peak cancel culture, and that going forward, it's going to be harder. I think Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter was a real tipping point in that conversation, in that mindset, and the mentality, regardless of whether, you like him or dislike him. I like him. I do think we've just reached a point, especially when it comes to people's jobs, doxing them, screaming them out of Ivy League universities, where the left will regroup on this. They're not going to give it up, don't get me wrong, but that there's just going to be a level of fatigue where, with all this idea of, let's say a college athlete said something untoward 5 years ago when they were 16 on Twitter. At some point, folks, I think we have to get past that. So maybe that's my hopeful or optimistic prediction for 23, is that peak cancel culture is now in the rearview mirror, and that whatever form that attempts to take going forward, it's not going to be the same. That we're just going to realize that people have to be able to live their lives, and they need to, this idea that we should unbank people, we should cut them off of social media, we should dox them, we should have them fired for their jobs. It's not in most people's interest to live in a society with that. And it's very Soviet, the idea of snitching on everybody for some minor transgression. I'm gonna say I'm optimistic that kind of a silent majority of Americans will maybe not put an end to that, but slow it appreciably.
I agree with you. I think the reasons for why it happened, the way I was thinking it through, is a little bit different from how you, but I reached the same conclusion you do. So one thing is just like how Trump, when he was first running, and just the stuff he was saying would have gotten anyone else to have to apologize and bend over backwards and bow out. And he was just, what? No, I'm not apologizing. You're like, look at these horrible things you said about women. He goes, no, that was just Rosie O'Donnell. That kind of stuff. No one had seen that done before, and how he just kept surviving. Similarly here, the stuff about Kanye West, just to bring that, what he said was just so shocking, and oh, okay, someone just did that, and now, okay, and we're going to go back to our lives after it dies down after a few days. And so, at this point, nothing anybody says is going to be shocking anymore, because he said literally the worst thing you can say is, I like Adolf Hitler. Yeah. And that's the worst thing you can possibly say, and he said it, and now the universe didn't explode. And so now, obviously he had ramifications and repercussions, don't get me wrong, but I'm just saying people aren't going to be shocked anymore. And also things are going to be so bifurcated, I think, and splintering off in a group that it's going to be hard to just get unified. Hey, we can all agree that this guy needs to be canceled, right? Because people are going to be arguing and you just called him a guy. Don't you know that that's, oppressive terminology? Yeah. You get what I'm saying? Yeah. There's going to be so much infighting in different coalitions that I don't think just to get this unified, we need to go punish this person with a 2-minute hate. Everyone's going to be too disorganized, I think, for that to continue.
Well, so much of the left's raison d'etre, so much of their absurd and bizarre self-image of being embattled is all based around Donald Trump and MAGA. And so they're gearing up for another round of Donald Trump and MAGA, and I don't think they're going to get it for the reasons I mentioned earlier in the political conversation. I don't think Donald Trump's going to be the nominee. And if you like Donald Trump, look, they're never ever going to let him be president. There's no question. They will indict him. They will go after him under the 14th Amendment. Even if they're unable to disqualify him as a candidate, they will find a way to uncertify the election even if they came to that, they just won't install him. Donald Trump will never be president of the United States again. I don't think. I mean, I just cannot imagine a scenario where that is sort of allowed to happen by the political class. Because again, it's not so much Democrats versus Republicans at the end of the day. So I it strikes me as maybe in my own Twitter bubble, Trump seems so done, so played. But yet there's this sort of silent majority out there that still really likes him. And I'm not tapped into them well enough to understand that there's a lot of people who will never admit it, just like last time, but they'll go vote for him. And he's going to be the president again. I mean, there are certainly people who believe that, right? There are people who absolutely believe that, but I don't think Trump MAGA is still the battlefield for progressives culturally. So I'm hopeful that whatever is the battlefield, it won't literally be the streets. So we'll just leave it at that, Bob. I want to, first of all, congratulate you on your move. I hope that you get settled in your new house. I hope you and your new baby and your other children and your wife have a very happy 2023. And I hope all of our listeners do the same. And I hope you'll stay with us. We got some great new shows planned for the coming year. So have a great weekend.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. And in the meantime, you can find more content like this at Mises.org.